So welcome back to Melodic Minds, a podcast where we aim to explore interdisciplinarity in the process of music creation. Our podcast is hosted by us, Dr. Lynn Falconer and Dr. Beth Mills, two researchers in the field of aquaculture and infectious disease.
For today's conversation, we are delighted to have Dr. Hannah Baxter with us. Hannah has been a conducting academic for over 15 years. She gained her PhD from the University of Sussex and in 2017 became founder and editor of Notes from the Podium, a unique quarterly online journal that publishes primary source in-depth interviews with conductors and peer-reviewed and journalistic articles. Through her work, Hannah has had the opportunity to interview and collaborate with many of the world's highest ranking and most prestigious conductors. Hannah, Lynn and I are so happy to have you on the podcast today. When we were talking about themes for the show, conducting was something that really intrigued us. We find it really impressive and a little bit magical. So even if we don't understand how it works from the practical perspective, we're hoping we can learn more today, and we find it really impressive. You're the perfect guest to talk to us about interdisciplinarity in conducting and how that leads to coordinated, complex musical performance. So welcome again.
Thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Like Beth, we're really intrigued about the world of conducting and composition. I wonder, just to kick it off in the spirit of the podcast, is what does the term interdisciplinarity mean to you?
I would say it's one of two things to me personally. If I'm studying a piece of music that involves collaboration with other art forms, so for example, a musical, which will have singers and costumes and stage design, and of course ballet with choreography, but even things like film, TV, but even songwriting, something like that, which has poetry as well as music. That is something I see as interdisciplinary. But more commonly, I think the second kind of view I have of it, which is the approach to research. So for example, if I'm looking at an aspect of the conductor's work, I might be looking at the historical context as well as the analysis of the music and how they relate to each other. Or perhaps I'll be interviewing conductors about their experience, but also analysing performances and kind of put those together. But even there is work by other academics where they combine the study of music and the study of choreography and combine them as well. So that's the kind of thing I have in mind regarding academia in my subject.
Hannah, I'm just curious on that, actually thinking about it, how you've sort of separated out there, maybe the intrinsic things that happen from a practitioner's perspective and then the academic analytical thinking about interdisciplinarity. Do you think that's almost a concept that we've come up with in academia to describe something that just happens naturally without thinking about it, because you know in that the arts and the practitioner side that's just what you need to make it succeed, whereas traditionally academia has been quite siloed, discipline specific, and it's almost like a new phenomenon that we consider academia in that interdisciplinary context?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. But when you become an expert in something or an academic kind of specialist, you do have to kind of focus in more and more and more. So by nature, the profession becomes less interdisciplinary. But yeah, I know what you mean. It's quite natural that most things you deal with, definitely in the world of music, are naturally kind of quite interdisciplinary. I'm really excited and encouraged about this kind of development in academia because it just gives a bigger picture. It's a more kind of holistic, with want of a better word, perhaps, kind of way of approaching a subject, which I think wards against kind of going down dead ends, too far. I don't know if you agree. When you look at something from another perspective, you can see actually, I think I'm getting a bit lost in something that isn't really relevant to the bigger picture of this topic.
Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe it partly depends on the purpose of your output or what you're thinking your output will be, because, music and the arts, you're trying to hopefully create something to share, I would assume. Whereas I guess traditionally a lot of academia, from sort of my domain anyway, might be studying a pathway to get a piece of knowledge, because you're fascinated with that and that bit of interest. But
yes.
The realm that I work in is much more translational, trying to develop products or implement things for the wider society that then need different people to come in to create something, even though it's not, a piece of music or a performance or a dance. It is something that requires many people to sort of see it, take it on, iterate it, and different skill sets to build that final thing.
I don't know if this is completely related to that point, but in terms of how I've approached this topic in my own mind for years, is that I see there's a benefit to both. There's a benefit to being very linear and very focused about what you're studying for a specific outcome, and you need to really stay on that track. And there's a benefit to thinking more in the interdisciplinary way. In some ways, it's almost like layers of understanding that kind of get built up. I don't know if that's how you feel about it when you're working in that way. And I think there's a place for both.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need both types of thinkers. And if academia welcomes that, I think that's the healthiest way, because there are pros and cons of both.
I really want to ask you, what does a conductor do? What goes into that? What gets you to that final place to be able to coordinate all of those musicians together to create that beautiful music?
Well, it's funny because people often think that conductors are just kind of waving a wand around in front of an orchestra, but actually that's the icing on the cake. Their work starts way before that. And if someone is a chief conductor or a music director of an orchestra, they are planning the music and what's going to be programmed years in advance. And even if you're not a music director of an opera house, I interviewed quite a lot of conductors of opera when I was living near Glyndebourne Opera House down in East Sussex. I recommend that as a place to visit if you're ever in the area and want a different experience. And I spoke to quite a lot of conductors down there, and they all quite commonly said that they will start learning an opera once they're booked for one about 3 years in advance.
That's a really incredible time frame to be working on. 3 years of preparation.
I mean, it's because these pieces are so long. It's not the full time. They're not doing that the whole time, but they're starting to learn it. They're maybe listening to recordings or playing bits at the piano and sorting out their understanding of everything. But it very often takes years. They're such long pieces. They're very commonly 3 hours long, and Wagner's longest opera is 4.5 hours long. And if you imagine how big these orchestras are, the conductor really has got to know exactly what's going on all the time. So the role of the conductors then starts long before, and a lot of their work is solitary. They'll be just looking at a score, and a lot of it's nuts and bolts, things like, I need to bring in the flute player here, I need to bring in the marimba here, and taking notes of all of that. And things like the tempo, how fast it is, how loud it is, just basic things like that. But it's also things like balance. I think of the conductor a bit as a human mixing desk. And so they're thinking to themselves when they're studying the piece, oh, right, the harp is doing something important there. I've got to make sure the brass aren't too loud. Or, the flute needs to be heard here, but they're not playing very high in their register. So I need to make sure the strings aren't overwhelming. That's, so all of those kind of things. But they also have to zoom out, just like a director of a play or a film would, and think, right, what is the composer really trying to say here? What is this piece about? What am I going to be communicating to the orchestra or the singers or whoever about the meaning of the piece? So there's a lot of going on just in the study of the music. Then there's the rehearsals. So you can imagine what that's like, putting everything together, responding to how the orchestra's playing, communicating your idea of the piece. But of course, as well, you're dealing with characters, say. So you got to have a really thick skin, as you can imagine. And so you're kind of like a manager and a teacher a bit as well. No, I don't think that. But, it's that kind of thing. And then, so finally, once you get to the performance, that's what you are seeing. That's what the audience is seeing. And so it's mainly keeping things together. I mean, orchestras aren't going to need to hang on every little thing, but it depends on how difficult the work is. So, yeah, they'll be kind of reminding them gesturally, perhaps what's being communicated in rehearsals, bringing people in, like I said, and things like that. But that really is the kind of the last step of a very long journey.
I mean, the skill set, I think, to be able to start like 3 years before and to be imagining all those different... And like, I think the description is like that human mixing desk is fantastic. It's really like a nice visual kind of, this is what this looks like.
Yes.
I would love to be able to think like that myself. Unfortunately, I don't. But I guess that it needs as well those sort of different ways of working, quite an appreciation of other skill sets and, like you say, how to bring that balance together. And then when it does come together and you're hearing it, also able to adjust it in that kind of place. So understanding that from a leadership point of view, those are different skill sets. So I wonder that the conductors that you work with and with your experiences, how do people manage that in terms of that creativity process?
Well, I think they obviously have to be very comfortable with leading people and being around a lot of people and with a lot of people watching them, obviously, as well. And also, like we just said, be very comfortable with being on their own for long periods of time. So they have to be quite kind of split personality, I suppose, in a way. There are certain aspects that can be practiced more easily than others. Things like score study, anyone can do if they go to the library and get out a score. And if they're interested in conducting, working with an orchestra, it's quite difficult to get the opportunity to stand in front of or especially a professional one. So that is kind of more difficult. But yes, they're quite unusual animals in a way, I suppose, in that they have a balance of intellect, but also managerial skills and instincts as well, all of that kind of thing. And they have a balance of that, which I don't think I've seen in many other professions. Not that I've witnessed every other profession, obviously, but having worked in different areas of education and all this kind of thing, I find them that, they're quite... I had a conductor friend who said to me as a joke, it's like we're the kind of animal that doesn't suit being around the other. Whereas violinists in orchestras, there's lots of them that are doing the same thing as you. And so if you have issues, you can kind of relate to each other. But the conductor is a very solitary and, dare I say, quite lonely profession as well.
Yeah, I'd never thought about it in that way. And yeah, it probably does take a very specific type of person want to be a conductor and have that sort of responsibility and role.
Yeah.
How does somebody, again, here comes my naivety here, but how does somebody train in that way and become a conductor?
Normally, it's very common for them to not necessarily focus on it straight away. There are a number of conductors who've perhaps been performers first, like violinists, pianists, not necessarily orchestral players. They might have been pianists or singers and then become conductors, almost like they work their way through into that kind of profession. Naturally, it kind of develops for them. But if you know that's what you want to do from a young age, it's more likely that you'll go to a university or a conservatoire. Perhaps you'll specialise in that if that's an option for you at the undergraduate level. But then you'll go and be for postgraduate study. And those courses are quite few and far between. They're very competitive. And it's mainly things like Guildhall School of Music, Royal College, Royal Academy, those kind of places that kind of offer that. It's very competitive, as you can imagine. And then from there, I mean, everyone's route into conducting professionally is very different. But there's invariably a lot of freelancing at first and other types of work on the side and all this kind of thing. And then they will eventually find their niche, let's say, or their place. But yes, it's normally postgraduate study that you see them kind of come into their own.
I don't think I would have really considered that as the route. I don't know, in my head, it would be much more sort of transitional from playing in the orchestra and then kind of progressing up through that way. So yeah, I didn't realise it was quite so academic, but having heard all the things that are entailed within it and need to be considered, it makes perfect sense that it would align to that.
It's very much that project management, leadership, and then I guess developing probably people are born with some sort of skill set in terms of intuition, as you sort of, which is sometimes hard to develop in a way, but more refining, establishing in the genuine way that somebody needs to lead.
I mean, it is possible to go up through the ranks in the orchestra as well. There have been a number of people who do it that way. They may be violinists and then they'll shift into conducting. But actually, what I've heard from the orchestral players is that there is quite a fixed hierarchy quite often in orchestras. And so although this doesn't necessarily just apply to conductors or conducting, it's quite common to not really work up within an orchestra. It's more common to leave that one and go to the next one. Whereas I think in academia, it's almost like the opposite. I know loads of academics who did their PhD at the university that they became a professor at. It's like the complete opposite. And I remember being quite shocked by that because I just have never really worked in that kind of environment, which is a bit more rigid. But you're right, the way of thinking of orchestral musicians in comparison to conductors. Another conductor I know, I remember he said it's like the orchestral players, they think it's micro. They're into the details, exactly where am I breathing? How am I bowing this? Exactly how are we going to breathe all together as a group and all of this kind of thing. It's like a finely tuned machine. You just can't imagine how in sync they are with each other. So it's all very, very micro. Whereas the conductor, as you can imagine, has to completely zoom out, and they're the only person that has in front of them the full score, every single person's line. So they have to think macro.
Yeah.
It's quite common for conductors to feel that they're just completely misunderstood by some of the players, because even though they're playing together on the same stage, or the conductor obviously conducting on the same stage as them, all the time, they just don't think in the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does a conductor tend to stay with the same orchestra, or do they freelance between different orchestras?
No, it's much more varied, actually. You get often a conductor staying with the same orchestra, perhaps more in musical theatre. But even then, you still get depths coming in and all of the rest of it. But actually, something like the music director of the London Philharmonic or the London Symphony Orchestra, or a big orchestra like that, the chief conductor will do X amount of concerts per year, or the music director, I should say, in those instances. So they'll do X amount of concerts per year, and then they'll have a principal guest conductor and all these other guests that are brought in. So it's very varied. So most instances, much more varied than academia. But also, that's even the same in something like an opera house, which is a fixed venue. And the music director will perhaps do 2 out of the 6 operas each season, and then 4 will be brought in.
Okay.
I don't know if that's useful, but that's how it works.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Like, again, listening to those sort of teamwork dynamics and how they might contrast with some of the ways that academia works, but it's coming together for that, bringing different ideas together in those kind of different leaderships and flows of ideas and stuff like that. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it keeps it more fresh.
Yeah.
I imagine it's then also quite interesting for the orchestras to then adapt to the different styles or different conductors that come in as well, because the orchestra probably stays as a unit,
Yes.
And then they have to adapt to that sort of new leadership that's coming in every, I don't know, few months or however often it changes. It's quite a big ask on them, I think, as well.
It is. And it's quite interesting how that works. I think it's different in America. There was a woman I spoke to who was a concert master, and that means the lead violinist, the top-notch violinist in the orchestra. And basically how it seemed to work with her orchestra was that there was a concert, or 2 or 3 concerts, depending on the week, every weekend. And there would be 4 or 5 days of rehearsal each week. So that was the routine for quite a lot of the season. I don't know exactly how much of the season was like this, but this is how she spoke. And she was saying how in some ways she has to act like the mediator sometimes, because she's more constant than the conductors. But interestingly, must be so difficult for the conductors in this respect, because she said pretty much I can tell how the whole week is going to go from Monday or Tuesday or whatever. You can, very often an orchestra would just decide how they feel about the conductor as soon as they just walk onto the podium in front of them. And that's tough.
Yeah, that must be quite brutal, really. If you're walking into a room, and if you're getting a cold shoulder before you come in, that takes some skills. I'm comparing it to sort of stand-up comics, and they walk in and either the room is with them or against them, and the pain of that when you're kind of stood alone is interesting. And also it kind of must be part and parcel of being an orchestra, that you have to be on that wave, that you're going to have different leadership coming in.
Yes.
It's really tough.
In terms of sort of the working process, how much of it is quite structured and how much of it is more of an intuition-based approach to sort of that conducting?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think obviously it does depend on each individual, and I can't speak for anyone with any certainty, but I do think it's a kind of a mixture between following your instincts and how it's going in the rehearsal and how much you plan out. You do need to plan it all out in advance, because you might look at a piece of music, even if it's not very long, even if it's 15 minutes, and you'll be looking at it thinking, okay, well, actually, an orchestra of this standard, they're going to play this bit fine. This is the tough section. This is the bit where we've got to sort this out. Or perhaps this is tough with the choreography on the stage, or whatever's happening in the opera, or whatever it might be. So they have to plan out which sections are going to need more focus than others. So that much is quite structured. But of course, you've got to respond to what's happening in the moment as well. And what works with one set of individuals is not going to work with the next. So I think, it's very much a kind of, you have to be kind of flexible with it. But like I think I said, they have quite a balance of of intellect and intuition. Generally, I think those people. But there are some that will be much more rigorous intellectually than others. Really depends on the personality.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm just interested in how when you have a piece of music and you're looking at it thinking, how would I develop this for how I want to conduct it and relay that back? Is that mindset and that approach different to if you were composing a brand new piece of music yourself?
Yes, actually, it's really different. It's quite, because if I'm writing a piece, and I've mainly written for theatre, dance kind of things, as well as perhaps some songwriting for choirs and things like that, it's almost like I think about the conducting side of it at the end, really, because I'm thinking more about the atmosphere and what I want to do creatively, what kind of sounds I'd like to create, or what kind of message I want to say about the character, or what I'm depicting about in the drama, that kind of thing, in that kind of frame of mind, much more in my own imagination, I suppose. But all the study I have done of conducting and how all of that works is so invaluable, because it's shown me so much about how their side of the work operates. And so therefore I have much more of a practical outlook. Whereas sometimes, especially when you're students, you're very much locked into just the kind of notes you want to write and the kind of atmosphere and the message. And that's all fantastic. But if it's not workable and if it's not playable, then it's not really going to get performed. But I definitely have an interdisciplinary way of seeing composing, which is actually even different again to my approach to conducting. And that's, well, of course, if I'm writing for theatre, then of course there's all of the collaborative side that we've already mentioned. That is in my mind, of course, as well. But actually, I don't know if you'd see this as interdisciplinary or not, so I'll just quickly say it in case you don't agree. But it's quite interesting. I don't know if this occurs in your work at all. If I'm writing a piece of music, it will come out differently, however I'm doing it. And what I mean by that is if I'm sitting at the piano, I'll write a different type of music if I'm sitting at the computer with the notation software in front of me, or if I've got my guitar. They're my instruments, guitar and piano. So quite often I'll go from one to the other because it will kind of give me a different route into the music and keep things a little bit more fresh. I've even still got a keyboard that's a bit like one that I had when I was about 10. And I would play. And of course, I mean, I would never actually perform anything of that. It'd be like that episode of Ross from Friends with his wordless sound poems. It would be that kind of level.
I think that's my current level.
And something I could only aspire to.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's actually really nice because that's another mindset for me to go into, which makes me feel like a little kid playing around. Just trying little sounds. So it's just different ways of accessing the music. And I do feel that it's quite an interdisciplinary process when I do that.
I completely agree. You said, I think that that's really the beauty of interdisciplinarity, and really where it becomes greater than the sum of its parts is when you're bringing one play, makes you so much more creative, and linking different pathways and different things together. I think that that's absolutely the beauty of it. And for me, that would be kind of my perfect definition and perfect approach to interdisciplinarity.
Oh, really? So even in your fields, and we're all from such different fields, you feel the same way?
It feels like you're in that creative, it just kind of flows and it's easy, and that's what gets you excited, isn't it? Oh, we can create this new thing, or we can try and create this new thing that hasn't happened yet, doesn't exist. It feels so satisfactory when you can bring different bits in and they just fit together nicely.
Yes.
And so there's definitely something about being in a room and being free and not knowing exactly what the outcome is, but maybe a general direction that you want to do something and figuring it out. For me, that is the pure joy of it.
I agree. And I think it's also, it's just thinking of some of the experiences I've had, some of the most exciting and the pieces of work that I've been most proud of have started in kind of non-traditional academic settings, i.e. dinner after work or a few drinks, and you start to explore kind of ideas because you're a bit more freer, you're creative, taking yourself into a different environment. I guess the same as kind of looking at something in a different way with a different instrument or something, or just a different space, that can really kickstart a creative process.
I remember years and years ago, I knew a man who was a psychotherapist. It just came back into my mind. In his room, he had on one wall a big picture of a skeleton and all the muscles and stuff like that. I think he'd also was very interested in kind of physiotherapy and all that kind of thing. And then on the other wall, he had this abstract painting. And if someone came to him for counselling, he would ask them to talk about the problem whilst looking at the diagram of the skeleton, and then whilst looking at the abstract painting on the other wall to see how it changed, to see how their perception changed.
I love that.
Yeah, I like that. We should do that.
Yeah, we should do that a lot more.
I should do that with my own studying or just life. But it's the same kind of idea, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, the brain can be stimulated with so many different ways. And I think it's even the power of music. We were talking about that just before we logged onto this call, about how we listen to music while we're working. And
yes.
Sometimes you're in the mood for some type of music or sometimes something else, and can kickstart different ideas as well. And for interdisciplinarity, where you want to explore areas which might not be as routine as what you might do normally if you're just focusing on quite a linear route, where you want to maybe free up your mind a little bit more.
Yeah.
Things like music can unlock that creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. Regardless of who you are, different types of music have such a different effect on how you're thinking. Absolutely.
I was wondering, can you share a story or some insight about how one of your projects has shifted directions, either due to unforeseen circumstances or a bolt of inspiration, maybe out of the blue, and how you and your team that you're working with has gone through that process?
One of the main things that comes to mind in terms of shifting direction was actually my PhD. Maybe that's not quite relevant in that sense, but it definitely was an interdisciplinary approach that was being shifted. For my PhD, I focused on the composer Stravinsky. And when I was looking at all the different performances, I got quite excited about the possibility of combining ideas from two professions I was qualified in, because in my early 20s, I worked for a few years as a sign language communicator. I worked mainly in higher education and maybe charities a bit and stuff like that. So in learning that, I did up to level 3 in BSL, it's called British Sign Language. And you learn all manner of kind of grammar. You have things like eyebrow grammar and placements, how you place the signs in front of you and use your space to communicate what's going on. You've got directional verbs, you've got all these different things going on. And because conductors, of course, have speaking with their hands, it's a gestural language in a way. I got quite excited about combining the two. I was thinking, well, all of that kind of grammar and theory that I had learnt with the sign language, surely I could perhaps apply that somehow and see what kind of comes of it. And my supervisor was very supportive about that. And we said, okay, so I got out all my old notes and I'm trawling through all of this, but it was a dead end. It just didn't translate. It didn't work because conducting isn't just a gestural language. There's a lot of communication, verbal communication as well. And also a gesture that I might do would have a completely different effect on a group of musicians than someone twice my size and from a different race or speaking a different language. There's so many factors that make certain movements appear totally different. But at the same time, that door closed, but the window opened, because the more I was studying different case studies, the more I started focusing on the ballets. When I was speaking to conductors about conducting these ballets, they were always talking about the difficult sections regarding the choreography. And I'd never really thought about including anything to do with dance in the thesis, but it was coming up all the time. And so it went in that direction. So it was still kind of interdisciplinary, but much more with the dance than the sign language. And so that's an example of the shift.
I think it's so important to always be looking at how you can make connections, especially relatively unique ones, of having that skill in the sign language and the interest in the conducting and the background in that, and even bringing that together, trying it to see if there was anything there and pivoting and coming up through to dance, which is what you ended up on, I think is brilliant, because you bring your whole self, not just your discipline, specialty and experience. And I think that's an incredible thing to do.
I've heard other people describe interdisciplinary work as being willing to try something that's quite risky, that you don't necessarily know if there will be an outcome or not, and where that will lead. And it might work out, it might not work out, it might branch off into something else, because true interdisciplinary is these different things have never been combined before.
Yes.
So we don't really know what's going to happen. Yeah. So I think it's great to take risks like that, because it's worthwhile finding out.
Like you say, even if it doesn't come to anything and it completely loses momentum, it doesn't matter because you know for next time.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's like, oh, that didn't quite work out, but I've learned lessons and I could take it this way or that. Or, yeah, I think it's fascinating to explore these roads that haven't been travelled.
I think even to reach that conclusion that you said, within conducting, the same gesture might be taken differently by an orchestra depending on who you are and who they are. I don't know if that's something within the profession that is considered and is explicitly thought about by different conductors, whether maybe implicitly people know they've tried something and they adapt their own ways based on feedback. But is that actually an area of academic investigation in its own right?
I haven't come across that in its own right. I mean, I've definitely come across it time and time again in my interviews. So in the kind of primary source. But there's definitely an acceptance that it's as much of a personality as it is an art. You hear that quite a lot. And I remember one conductor, brilliant man, he's now the music director of the Royal Opera House. Sorry, it's now called the Royal Ballet and Opera, I should say. And he put it really well. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I have a lot of strong instincts about the music, but I'm always questioning those as I'm rehearsing, as I'm going along. And he said, because music isn't just thinking about music, it's about doing it as well. He says, but I do respect that if their heart is on their sleeve and they're very, very flamboyant, and that just works for them to work in that way, especially if the music suits it, perhaps as well, then he respects that works for that individual, even though that's not for him. And then about one or two other conductors he knows that are very, very cerebral, more academic in the way they approach everything and quite set opinions, at least at that point in time, about how they want every little detail. But if that works for that person in that situation, that's great. So it really is about respecting how different people work best in their environments.
It kind of shows that the outcome and the output can be very similar, but just different people have different ways of working and approaches to get there. And I think having that respect, as you said, to understand that everybody is different, working towards the same goals, and actually observing that what can we maybe take and learn for ourselves that might alter something slightly, and what will and won't work for us. Like, we're not trying to replicate and be someone else at the same time, about that authenticity, which is something that we've spoken about before.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, that just lends itself really well to what you were just saying.
Yeah. And also, I'll say quickly to that, I lived for a while with a woman she's much older than me. She was my landlady, and I was living in her house. She was absolutely massive in advertising. She's now in her 80s. Anyway, she was huge in advertising. And because she's working in that kind of corporate but also artistic field, she said, maybe she was being quite black and white about it, but she said there was almost like there was the logical thinkers and then the intuitive thinkers. And she said they would often come to these similar conclusions, but what would happen was the logical ones would be getting there step by step by step, whereas the intuitive ones seemed to be going around in circles for a little while. Then suddenly she called it intuitive leaps, and suddenly they'd be ahead perhaps of the logical thinkers who would be going, hey, how did you get there? Because it's just two different ways of thinking, and they're both great. It's just we need both in this world,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where the strong teams come in as well, when you can sort of accept that diversity of viewpoint and those different backgrounds as well to come together to tackle some of the challenges and questions that people have.
Yeah, absolutely. No, brilliant. Variety is the spice of life.
I just wondered, based on your experiences or things that you might have observed, what challenges have you seen in terms of aligning vision and outputs with collaborators from different disciplines or different fields?
Although this is still the orchestra, because they are, as you can imagine, very different disciplines. Playing the percussion is very different to playing the flute, is very different to playing the trumpet. Anyway, I've done a series of interviews recently with principal players of an orchestra, and it's been really interesting to hear about how there can be clashes in this way between the players of different disciplines. Not clashes as in arguments, but clashes as in what makes life difficult for each other. Sometimes conductors, especially when they're wanting to create a performance that's true to the time where the composer wrote it. And this is called historically informed practice, HIP. Anyway, if the conductor is keen on creating situations similar to what the composer was writing for back in the day, they might shift the placements of the orchestra around. So they might say, for example, put the double bass behind the violins instead of behind the cellos. But I was speaking to a double bassist about this recently, and he said, oh, yeah, that's fine, but it makes things very difficult for us because if we can't hear all of the other low instruments, we get lost. And also, if we're behind the violins and near the woodwind and everything, and all of that high kind of loud noise is going into their left ear, he said, that's the ear I use to tune. So I'm more likely to play out of tune if I'm surrounded by high instruments. So it's like, my goodness, it's so finely tuned, like I said before. And they have this, quite a lot. And then another example of the clash, like you say, in kind of the disciplines is between the conductor and percussion. So a conductor might say, okay, for the first half of this rehearsal, we're going to do Debussy. For the second half, we're going to do Stravinsky or something like this. And there'll be a break in between. Perhaps they'll finish working on the Debussy and think, oh, well, actually, I'm doing ever so well here. Let's get going on the Stravinsky and we can get more done. And so off they'll go. And then all of a sudden, they'll look to the percussion and they're not doing anything. And they'll be thinking, what's going on? But the percussion, they have to rearrange everything for the next piece because there are certain pieces that have heaps of percussion and others that hardly have anything at all, maybe some cymbals or something, and that's it. And so you can imagine they have to do all of that in the break. So this is a very, very silly, practical, logical thing. But unless you're a percussionist dealing with that a lot, you probably forget. And so that they're like, the conductor's kind of looking towards the percussion and they're still wheeling on the vibraphone or something. Going, hang on. So there's things like that.
It's really fascinating. I am just drawing on my own research. I work on aquaculture and farming fish in the sea. And we quite often have a saying in my research group that context matters because there's no two farms are the same. And you have to understand all of those different components that kind of make that farm successful and how the fish are actually farmed. And I guess it's a bit similar there that musical performance depends on the pieces being arranged in a certain way to make the most of the role that needs to be done. So they're very different fields, but there's similarities in that context matters. Need to understand what's going on and how all those different pieces can be optimized to have the best performance at the end of the day.
Yeah, God, I feel like I want to interview you now about all of that.
Next time.
That's amazing. But it's absolutely because you're looking at a whole ecosystem. Would you use that term? So, and actually I've used the term ecosystem about an orchestra in my own mind lots of times because you just change one thing and everything gets,
Absolutely, because you need all those bits to come together, but they need to be in the right position in order to go. So, yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, and orchestral players, they're actually creatures of habit, I've been told, a few times, because even though they're traveling the world and they're meeting these famous conductors and singers and players and everything, all around the world all the time, all these different places, they sit at the same point, in the same position, I should say, on the stage and have done every time. And they have done so since they were about 10. And they said, I think a flautist that I was speaking to said, oh, yeah, when the horns had to come down forward a notch because of XYZ piece they were playing, that they were all a little bit disconcerted by this because they're just, and so then I'm thinking, I'm more set in a routine because I'm in one place all the time. And then, no, they don't want to shift a bit to the right. It's weird, isn't it? We just don't realise we all get our funny little ways.
So before we wrap up today on what has been honestly an illuminating, enjoyable, really fun conversation, is there anything else you would like to say? Anything that you would like to plug for the people that are listening to this?
It's been very, very enjoyable for me too. It's been lovely. In terms of my own work to plug, well, if anyone's interested in these topics, my journal can be found at www.notesfromthepodium.co.uk. And there's a fair amount of free access material on there. It's very accessible. And so I do know non-musicians who've enjoyed it as well as the professionals. But yes, I think just a couple of musical works, I should say, that really resonate with me that I would recommend just for fun, perhaps to just give people an idea of how well interdisciplinarity can work in my field. I would say I've got two very quick examples. One is extremely mainstream and one is very left field. So I thought that would be a bit of fun. The very mainstream one is the musical West Side Story.
Nice.
There's so many great theatre works or films that collaborate, where the collaboration is top notch. But in that, the 4 main professionals that collaborated there were the top notch kind of ones working at the time. You've got Leonard Bernstein doing the music. And if you don't think you know the music, you will if you hear it. Stephen Sondheim, who later on became a huge giant in musical theatre, he did the lyrics. Arthur Lawrence did the book, and Jerome Robbins did the choreography, and they were absolutely all huge in their respective fields at the time. And it was quite a fiery collaboration, but they really raised each other up as a result. And I know even the musicians that I know that are very purist into classical music, they all have time for West Side Story and say it's a masterpiece, even if they don't like musicals. And the left field one is actually a perfume house that I've discovered a couple of months ago called L'Orchestra Parfum. Please excuse my French accent. That is a French perfume house, and they've got about 15 or 16 fragrances, and each one has an accompanying piece of music written especially for it.
Okay.
And they call it a multi-sensory journey. It's music from all over. You have like a flamenco piece, there's a trombone piece, there's music from the Sahara, Japan, the Appalachian Mountains, and that, you know, is attached to a certain fragrance. And so you can listen to that as well as smell the smell. And it just kind of raises the whole experience. And I thought that was great.
I think both are great examples. And I think that the second one especially is those different senses and how those all link together to create a kind of bigger experience. That's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, Hannah. This is excellent. I really could go on for days about this. I think you've opened up a new world for conducting for me. I'm going to have a little internet to search later.
Oh, feel free to email me and let me know what you found.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's lovely to meet you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
This has been Melodic Minds. Thank you so much for joining us today. This podcast is executive produced by me, Beth Mills, and Lynn Falconer. Our producer is Paula Gomez, with sound engineering and mixing also by Paula Gomez. We're supported by the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship Development Network. Special thanks to our guests, listeners, and everyone who makes this possible. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate, review, and subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts. Drop us a message at melodicminds@gmail.com or find us on socials at melodicminds.